The kingdom of Blackstone had once been the pride of every werewolf kingdom. Its warriors were unmatched, its borders stretched farther than any neighboring realm, and merchants traveled for weeks just to trade inside its prosperous cities. Songs were written about its victories, and every alpha dreamed of standing beside its mighty ruler. But glory does not last forever. Years of war had drained the kingdom of its wealth. Enemy raids had burned farms that once fed thousands. Merchants had abandoned dangerous trade routes, and the royal treasury, once overflowing with gold, had become nearly empty. Every sunrise brought worse news than the day before. Soldiers had gone unpaid for months, families struggled to find food, and whispers of rebellion slowly spread through villages that had once proudly called themselves loyal to the crown. High above the capital city, inside the enormous royal council chamber, Alpha King Zevian sat alone at the long oak table, where generations of kings had ruled before him. Thick scrolls covered every inch of the polished wood. Some contained tax records, others listed unpaid debts, while several displayed reports from villages begging for food before winter arrived. Candles burned low around the chamber, their flickering light revealing the exhaustion carved across Zevian's handsome face. His black royal cloak rested heavily over his shoulders, and the silver crown upon his head suddenly felt heavier than ever before. He had not slept properly in weeks. Every night he searched desperately for a way to save his people, yet every solution seemed to demand another sacrifice. Slowly he picked up another report and read the final line before quietly placing it back onto the table. The royal treasury contains enough gold for only 13 more days. Zevian closed his eyes. For several moments the chamber remained completely silent, except for the crackling fire burning inside the massive stone fireplace. "I failed them," he whispered to himself. His voice echoed softly through the empty room. He had promised his late father he would become the greatest Alpha King Blackstone had ever known. Instead, he now ruled over a kingdom standing on the edge of ruin. Every decision he made seemed to create another disaster. Every victory came with a greater loss. A sudden knock interrupted his thoughts. "My king?" It was Beta Ronan. "Come in." The heavy wooden doors slowly opened as Ronan stepped inside. His armor was still covered with dust from riding across the kingdom, yet his posture remained respectful. He bowed before looking toward his king with obvious concern. "You haven't eaten since yesterday." "I'm not hungry." "You haven't slept either." "I'll sleep when my people stop starving." Ronan sighed quietly. He had known Zevian since they were children. Before becoming king, Zevian laughed easily, trained harder than anyone else, and believed no problem was impossible to solve. The crown had changed him, not because power had corrupted him, but because responsibility had slowly crushed the joyful man he used to be. "My king," Ronan said carefully, "there's someone here to see you." Zevian didn't look up. "Who?" Ronan hesitated. "King Magnus." The room instantly became colder. Zevian slowly lifted his eyes. "What does he want?" "He says he has a solution." Zevian gave a bitter smile. Solutions from Magnus always come with a price. Ronan remained silent. Everyone knew King Magnus ruled the wealthiest kingdom in the north. While Blackstone struggled through famine and debt, Crimson Moon Kingdom grew richer every year. Magnus was respected for his intelligence, but feared for the bargains he made. He never started wars. He simply waited until desperate people came to him. After several seconds, Zevian finally stood. "Bring him in." Only moments later, the enormous council doors opened once again. King Magnus entered with calm, confident steps. His dark crimson cloak brushed across the polished stone floor as he approached the council table. Unlike Zevian, Magnus looked rested. His kingdom knew prosperity instead of hunger, and it showed in every detail of his appearance. Gold embroidery decorated his clothing, Expensive rings rested upon his fingers, and his expression carried the quiet confidence of a man who already knew the outcome of the conversation before it even began. "Alpha King Zevian," Magnus greeted politely. "King Magnus." The two rulers stared at one another. Neither smiled. Magnus slowly sat opposite Zevian without waiting to be invited. "I've heard troubling news." "So have I." Magnus folded his hands together. "Blackstone is collapsing." Zevian remained silent. "I've also heard your treasury will be empty before the next full moon." Still, silence. Magnus leaned forward slightly. "I came because I can save your kingdom." For the first time, Zevian looked directly into his eyes. "How?" Magnus calmly removed a rolled document from inside his cloak and placed it on the table. "If you sign this agreement," he gently pushed the parchment forward, "every debt Blackstone owes will disappear." Ronan's eyes widened. Zevian frowned. "No interest?" "None." "No conditions?" Magnus smiled faintly. "One condition." The chamber became silent again. Magnus spoke slowly. "I want your mate." Ronan stepped forward immediately. "What?" Magnus ignored him. "I want Luna Nyra." The words struck the room like thunder. Zevian's chair scraped loudly across the stone floor as he stood. "You've lost your mind." Magnus remained completely calm. "I have no interest in taking her as my mate. There is an alliance being formed between several northern kingdoms. They require a royal Luna of noble blood to complete an ancient agreement." Zevian's eyes narrowed. "And you expect me to hand over my wife?" "I expect you to save your people." "No." Magnus quietly nodded. "I thought you might answer that way." He calmly reached into another leather case and placed several additional reports across the table. "The eastern villages have only enough grain for 9 days." Another report. 300 soldiers deserted your northern border yesterday because they haven't received wages." Another. "If nothing changes," Magnus looked directly into Zevian's eyes, "your kingdom will fall before winter." Every report carried the royal seal of Blackstone. They were real. Magnus hadn't lied. He simply knew the truth. Zevian stared silently at the reports scattered before him. Every page represented lives. Children, families, soldiers, mothers, an entire kingdom depending on him. Magnus finally stood. "I'll give you until sunrise." He adjusted his gloves. "Choose." His voice remained calm. "One woman," he looked toward the enormous palace windows overlooking the starving city below. "Or an entire kingdom." Without another word, Magnus turned and walked out of the council chamber. The heavy doors slowly closed behind him. Silence filled the room. Ronan looked toward his king. "My king." Zevian didn't answer. He simply stood there, staring at the reports scattered across the table. For the first time in his life, Alpha King Zevian truly believed there was no right choice, only different kinds of heartbreak. While the fate of Blackstone Kingdom was being decided inside the royal council chamber, Luna Nyra knew nothing about the impossible choice standing before her mate. She had spent the entire morning in one of the palace kitchens, her sleeves rolled above her wrists as she worked side by side with the royal servants, kneading dough and helping prepare hundreds of fresh loaves of bread that would later be sent to the poorest villages surrounding the capital. The delicious smell of warm bread filled the air, and despite the sadness hanging over the kingdom, Nyra still smiled gently at everyone around her. She believed that even in the darkest times, kindness could give people enough strength to survive another day. Unlike many royal Lunas, who preferred luxurious gowns and endless banquets, Nyra had never considered herself above the people. Since marrying Zevian 3 years earlier, she had spent more time among ordinary families than inside the royal ballroom. She knew the names of widows who had lost husbands during the war, remembered the birthdays of orphan children living inside the palace, and personally delivered food whenever supplies reached struggling villages. To the people of Blackstone, she was not simply their Luna. She was the heart of the kingdom. A small boy, no older than 7, suddenly tugged gently on the edge of her dress, while she carefully placed another loaf inside a large basket. His cheeks were covered in flour, making several nearby servants laugh softly. "My lady," the little boy asked shyly, "do you think the Alpha King will fix everything?" Nyra looked down at him before kneeling, so they were at the same height. She smiled warmly and brushed a little flour from his nose. "I believe your Alpha King loves this kingdom with all his heart." The boy nodded. "Then why does everyone look so worried?" For a brief moment, Nyra's smile became smaller. She had noticed the worried faces too. Every servant whispered quietly whenever they thought she wasn't listening. Royal guards had become unusually serious during the past several weeks, and even Zevian had begun spending almost every night inside the council chamber, instead of joining her for dinner. She missed him terribly. There had been a time when they laughed together over the smallest things, taking long walks through the palace gardens after sunset, or sitting beside the lake outside the capital, while dreaming about the family they hoped to build one day. The war had not only wounded the kingdom, it had slowly stolen pieces of the man she loved. She gently cupped the little boy's face before answering. Sometimes adults carry worries because they want children to keep smiling. The boy thought carefully before hugging her tightly around the waist. "I like it when you smile too." Nyra laughed softly as she hugged him back. "Then I suppose I'll have to keep smiling." The servants nearby watched the scene, with tears quietly forming in their eyes. Moments like these reminded them why everyone loved their Luna. Even while carrying the burdens of a queen, she always found time to comfort those around her. As the afternoon sun slowly disappeared behind thick gray clouds, Nyra finally left the kitchens, carrying several baskets filled with bread. She personally delivered them to the orphanage, located just beyond the palace walls. The children immediately ran toward her the moment she arrived. "Luna Nyra!" They surrounded her, laughing excitedly. One little girl proudly showed Nyra a flower crown she had made from wildflowers growing near the river. Another handed her a small wooden carving, shaped like a wolf. "We made it for you." Nyra accepted the gift carefully, as though it were the most valuable treasure in the kingdom. "It's beautiful." The little girl smiled brightly. "It looks like Alpha King Zevian." Nyra laughed. "I think you're right." She turned the tiny carving over in her hands. "Then I'll keep it forever." The children cheered happily before helping carry the baskets of fresh bread inside the orphanage. For nearly 2 hours, Nyra forgot about kingdoms, wars, and politics. She listened to stories, read from an old fairy tale book, and even joined several children in a playful game that left everyone laughing so loudly the sound echoed across the gardens. Watching from a distance, several palace guards smiled quietly. "Our Luna deserves the world," one whispered. "She already gives this kingdom everything she has," another replied. None of them knew those words would soon become painfully true. Back inside the royal palace, Alpha King Zevian had not moved from the council chamber since King Magnus left. Darkness had completely fallen outside, yet dozens of candles still burned across the enormous table covered with financial reports. Beta Ronan remained nearby, refusing to leave his king alone. "My king," Zevian didn't answer. "You've been staring at the same report for almost an hour." Still, silence. Finally, Zevian looked toward the palace window overlooking the city below. Thousands of lights flickered across the capital as families prepared simple evening meals, completely unaware that their future depended upon one impossible decision. "I promised my father," his voice sounded distant, "that I would never let Blackstone fall." Ronan stepped closer. "And you won't." Zevian smiled bitterly. "What if saving it costs me everything else?" Ronan had no answer. The silence between them grew heavier. A few moments later, another palace servant hurried into the chamber before bowing respectfully. "My king." "What is it?" "The Luna has returned from the orphanage." Zevian closed his eyes. He suddenly remembered. She still knew nothing. For one brief, impossible moment, he considered refusing Magnus's offer completely. He imagined walking away from the council chamber, finding Nyra in the gardens, and pretending none of this had ever happened. They could live together for whatever time remained before the kingdom collapsed. They could face the future side by side. But then another image appeared inside his mind. Hungry children, cold winters, villages burning, thousands depending on him. His heart broke all over again. "Ask the Luna to come to my chambers." The servant bowed. "Immediately, my king." Meanwhile, Nyra had just returned to her room after spending the afternoon with the orphan children. She carefully placed the little wooden wolf beside the flowers decorating her window, before changing into a simple pale blue gown. She smiled as she remembered the children's laughter. Then came a knock. "My lady, come in." A young palace maid entered nervously. "The Alpha King wishes to see you." Nyra immediately smiled. "Now?" "Yes." She noticed the maid avoiding eye contact. "Is everything all right?" The maid hesitated. I don't know." Nyra's heart suddenly beat a little faster. Without asking another question, she quietly followed the servant through the long palace corridors. As they approached the royal chambers, she noticed something strange. No guards were speaking. No servants smiled. Even the air itself felt unusually heavy. The maid stopped outside Zevian's doors. "The Alpha King is waiting." Nyra thanked her gently before raising her hand. She knocked softly. "Come in." The moment she stepped inside, she immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Zevian stood beside the enormous palace window with his back turned toward her, staring into the darkness outside. The room contained only the soft crackling of the fireplace. He didn't turn around. He didn't smile. He didn't say her name. And for the first time since they became mates, Nyra felt afraid of what her husband was about to say. The heavy wooden doors closed softly behind Luna Nyra, leaving only her and Alpha King Zevian inside the royal chamber. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. The fire burning inside the stone fireplace crackled gently, but even that comforting sound could not chase away the strange silence filling the room. Nyra remained standing near the entrance, watching the man she loved stare out of the tall palace window. His broad shoulders looked unusually tense, and although his back was turned toward her, she could already tell something had changed. Zevian had always carried the weight of the kingdom on his shoulders, but tonight it looked as though that weight had finally become too much for even the strongest Alpha to bear. She slowly walked toward him, her footsteps almost silent against the polished stone floor, stopping only when she stood a few feet behind him. "You wanted to see me?" she asked softly. Zevian closed his eyes before answering, "Yes." His voice was quiet, almost empty. Nyra frowned slightly. She had never heard him sound like this before. Even during the darkest days of war, when enemy armies stood outside the kingdom's walls, Zevian's voice had always carried confidence. Tonight, however, it carried only exhaustion. She stepped closer until she stood beside him. The moonlight pouring through the window illuminated both of their faces as they overlooked the sleeping capital below. Hundreds of tiny lanterns flickered throughout the city, each one representing a family depending on their king. "They're beautiful tonight," Nyra whispered. Zevian looked down at the city. "They're hungry." Nyra slowly reached for his hand. "They still believe in you." He laughed quietly. It wasn't the laugh she loved. It carried no happiness. "Belief doesn't fill empty stomachs." Nyra gently squeezed his hand. "We'll find another way." Those words pierced his heart. If only she knew how desperately he wanted them to be true. For several long moments, He struggled to find the courage to speak. Every sentence formed inside his mind, only to disappear again before reaching his lips. How could he possibly tell the woman who had stood beside him through every hardship that he had just agreed to destroy their future? How could any husband say such words to the woman he loved? Finally, he let go of her hand. Nyra immediately noticed. A strange fear settled inside her chest. She looked at him carefully. Zevian. He still couldn't meet her eyes. I met with King Magnus today. Nyra nodded slowly. I heard he arrived. He brought an offer. What kind of offer? Zevian inhaled deeply. The kind that saves kingdoms. Nyra smiled gently. Then perhaps there's hope. Her smile disappeared when he remained silent. She turned fully toward him. What did he ask for? He swallowed painfully. Everything. Nyra stared at him. I don't understand. Zevian finally forced himself to look into her eyes. For a brief second, he almost abandoned the entire agreement. One look at her face was enough to make every promise he had made to the kingdom seem impossible to keep. But then, the soldiers, the children. His voice barely existed when he finally spoke. He agreed to erase every debt Blackstone owes. Nyra's eyes widened. That's wonderful. No. He shook his head slowly. It isn't. Her heartbeat quickened. What did he want in return? Silence. The answer refused to leave his lips. Nyra stepped closer. Zevian. He looked away again. He wanted something only I could give. Her breathing became slower. What? His entire body felt heavy. Finally, he whispered the words. He wanted you. The room became completely still. Nyra blinked once. Surely, she had misunderstood. She gave a nervous laugh. What do you mean? He closed his eyes. He asked me to send you with him. Why? He needs a royal Luna to complete an alliance. Nyra frowned. And you refused? Silence. She waited. Surely he would say yes. Surely he would laugh and tell her the conversation had ended there. Instead, his silence answered first. The color slowly disappeared from Nyra's face. No. Her voice became almost a whisper. You didn't. Zevian remained motionless. She stepped backward. You didn't. He finally spoke. I had no choice. The words shattered something inside her. She stared at him in complete disbelief. No choice? Her voice shook. I'm your mate. He looked down. I know. You promised before the moon goddess that no one would ever separate us. I know. You said we'd face every storm together. Ears gathered in her eyes. And tell me this is a nightmare. His own eyes filled with pain. I wish I could. Nyra felt her knees becoming weak. She reached for the nearby chair before slowly sitting down. Everything around her suddenly felt distant. The fireplace, the moonlight, the palace walls. Nothing seemed real anymore. After several moments, she finally looked back at him. So, her voice trembled. You agreed? He nodded once. The tiny movement hurt her more than any scream ever could. You, she struggled to breathe. You traded me? Zevian immediately answered, No. Then what did you do? He looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. I sacrificed the person I love most. His voice cracked. To save the people I swore to protect. Nyra slowly stood again. Fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. I never asked you to sacrifice me. No answer. She stepped closer until they stood face to face. If the kingdom was dying, her voice grew stronger. Why didn't you trust me enough to decide with you? Silence. You decided my future without even asking me. He lowered his head. I was trying to protect you. She laughed bitterly. Protect me? Another tear rolled down her face. By giving me away? Every word felt like another knife. I thought. His breathing became uneven. It was the only way. Nyra searched his face desperately, looking for the husband she had loved, looking for the young Alpha who once promised they would never face hardship alone. Instead, she saw only a broken king crushed beneath responsibility. She whispered quietly, "When did you stop seeing me as your wife?" Another tear fell. "And start seeing me as something you could trade?" Zevian immediately shook his head. "Never." "Then why does it feel that way?" He couldn't answer, because no answer existed. The silence between them became unbearable. Finally, Nyra took a slow breath. "When do I leave?" Zevian closed his eyes. "At sunrise." Those two words broke the last piece of her heart. She nodded once, very slowly. "I understand." She turned toward the door. Halfway there, she stopped. Without looking back, she spoke softly. "I loved being your Luna." Her voice trembled. But more than that, she wiped away another tear. "I loved being your wife." The room fell silent again. "And I hope," she struggled to finish, "that saving this kingdom gives you everything you were willing to lose." She quietly opened the door, then walked away. Zevian remained standing exactly where she had left him. Only after the door closed did the Alpha King collapse onto his knees. For the first time since wearing the crown, he buried his face in his hands and cried like a man who had just destroyed his own heart. The palace corridor stretched endlessly before Luna Nyra as she walked away from the royal chamber. Every step echoed softly against the polished marble floor, yet she could barely hear it over the sound of her own heartbeat. The tears she had fought so hard to hold back finally escaped, rolling silently down her cheeks. She did not run. She did not scream. She simply kept walking with the quiet dignity that had always defined her. Several servants passed by, bowing respectfully as they always did, smiling politely because they knew nothing about the conversation that had just taken place. Nyra forced herself to return each smile, unwilling to let them see the storm raging inside her. They had already suffered enough because of the kingdom's hardships. She refused to place her own pain upon their shoulders. As she turned into the long hallway leading toward her private chambers, memories began attacking her from every direction. There was the large window where Zevian had once surprised her with the first snowfall after they married, carrying her outside despite her protests so they could dance beneath the falling snow like children. There was the small reading room where they spent rainy evenings, sharing stories while sitting before a worn fire. At the far end of the hallway stood the balcony, where Zevian had promised her, on the night of their mating ceremony, that no matter how difficult life became, they would always face it together. Every corner of the palace carried a piece of their love, and now each memory felt like a knife twisting deeper into her heart. When she finally entered her room, she quietly locked the door behind her. The silence felt overwhelming. She slowly removed the silver necklace resting around her neck, placing it carefully on the dressing table before sinking onto the edge of the bed. She looked around the room that had been her home for 3 years, the embroidered curtains she had chosen herself, the books Zevian had collected because he knew she loved reading, the vase of dried moon lilies sitting near the window, flowers Zevian had personally planted in the royal gardens because she once told him they reminded her that hope could bloom even in darkness. She reached for one of the dried flowers and held it gently between her fingers. "You promised me," she whispered through tears. Her voice broke. "You promised." For the first time since leaving the council chamber, she allowed herself to cry without restraint. Her sobs echoed through the empty room as months of fear, loneliness, and heartbreak poured out of her. She cried for the future they would never have. She cried for the children they had dreamed of raising together. She cried because the man she loved had believed saving his kingdom required losing his family. Nearly an hour passed before her tears finally slowed. Exhausted, she leaned back against the pillows and closed her eyes. Suddenly, a powerful wave of nausea rushed through her body. She covered her mouth and hurried toward the washroom, barely reaching it before becoming violently sick. When it finally passed, she remained kneeling on the cold stone floor, breathing heavily. This was the third morning in less than a week that she had felt this strange sickness, but until now, she had blamed stress and exhaustion. Tonight, however, something felt different. Very slowly, she placed both hands over her stomach. Her heartbeat quickened. No. The single word escaped as little more than a whisper. Could it be? She closed her eyes. Her monthly cycle had not come. She had been unusually tired. The sickness, the dizziness, every sign suddenly fit together. Fear and hope collided inside her chest. Without wasting another moment, she quickly wrapped a warm cloak around her shoulders and quietly left her chambers. Most of the palace had already gone to sleep, allowing her to move through the hallways, unnoticed. She made her way toward the oldest wing of the castle, where the royal healer had lived for more than 40 years. The elderly woman looked surprised when she opened the door. "My Luna?" Nyra forced a weak smile. "I'm sorry for coming so late." The healer immediately stepped aside. "Come inside." She studied Nyra's pale face carefully. "Something is wrong." Nyra nodded. "I think," she hesitated, "I need you to examine me." The healer gently helped her sit near the fireplace, before preparing several herbs and medical instruments. Nearly an hour passed as she carefully completed the examination. Throughout the entire process, Nyra remained silent, her hands clasped tightly together. Finally, the healer looked up, her old eyes filled with tears. "My Luna." Nyra searched her face anxiously. "What is it?" The healer smiled. "It's wonderful news." Nyra's heart pounded. "You are carrying a child." Everything around her disappeared. She could barely speak. "A child?" The healer nodded happily. "The moon goddess has blessed you." Nyra instinctively placed both hands over her stomach. She was going to be a mother. She and Zevian were going to have the child they had prayed for since the beginning of their marriage. Joy exploded inside her heart. Then, just as quickly, reality crashed down upon her. By sunrise, she would no longer be his wife. Fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. The healer frowned. "My Luna?" Toward the fire burning softly beside them. "He sent me away." The healer's smile disappeared. "What?" She nodded. "He agreed to King Magnus's bargain." The elderly woman's face turned pale. "No." Nyra quietly wiped away her tears. "I leave at sunrise." The healer slowly sat down beside her, unable to believe what she had heard. Then she looked at Nyra's stomach. "My Luna." Her voice trembled. "The Alpha King must know." Nyra remained silent. "He deserves to know he's going to be a father." Nyra closed her eyes. The image of Zevian standing before her replayed in her mind. The way he couldn't even look into her eyes. The way he chose the kingdom. The way he had already decided her future without asking what she wanted. When she finally opened her eyes again, they were filled not with anger, but heartbreak. "If he truly wanted us," she whispered softly, "he would never have let me go." The healer reached for her hand. "My Luna." Nyra gently squeezed it. "I won't tell him." The old woman stared at her in disbelief. "He has already made his choice." Another tear slipped down Nyra's cheek. "I won't force him to make another." Outside, beyond the palace walls, the first faint light of dawn slowly began touching the horizon. Morning was coming, and with it, the day Nyra would leave, the only home she had ever known. The first rays of dawn slowly crept over the mountains surrounding Blackstone Kingdom, painting the sky with soft shades of gold and crimson. Normally, sunrise brought hope to the capital. Merchants would begin opening their shops, children would run through the streets chasing one another, and the smell of fresh bread would drift from the village ovens into the palace gardens. But this morning felt different. A strange silence hung over the kingdom, as though the moon goddess herself knew that something precious was about to be lost. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual, their songs replaced by an uneasy stillness that settled over every stone wall of the royal palace. Inside her chambers, Nyra stood before the large window, overlooking the kingdom she had loved with all her heart. She had not slept at all. Every hour of the night had been spent sitting beside the fireplace, gently resting one hand over the tiny life growing inside her, while the other held the small wooden wolf the orphan children had carved for her only yesterday. Her eyes were swollen from crying, yet there was a calmness upon her face that had not been there the night before. She had cried until there were no tears left. Now only acceptance remained. She slowly turned away from the window and looked around the room one final time. It no longer felt like a royal chamber. It felt like a collection of memories waiting to say goodbye. Her fingers brushed gently across the bookshelf Zevian had built with his own hands during the first winter of their marriage, because she had once joked that she owned more books than the palace library. She smiled sadly as she remembered him spending an entire afternoon measuring the wood incorrectly, before laughing at himself when the shelves leaned slightly to one side. He had insisted on rebuilding it from the beginning, but she had refused. Imperfections make things beautiful, she had told him. That crooked bookshelf still stood proudly against the wall. She walked toward the wardrobe and quietly opened its carved wooden doors. Inside hung dozens of elegant gowns made for royal ceremonies, banquets, and celebrations. She looked at them for a long moment before gently closing the doors again. Those dresses belonged to the Luna of Blackstone. She no longer believed that woman existed. Instead, she chose a simple cream-colored traveling dress, wrapping herself in a dark blue cloak to shield against the morning cold. Her long black hair was braided neatly over one shoulder, and she wore only one piece of jewelry, the silver necklace her late mother had given her years before she met Zevian. Everything else remained behind. Beside the bed rested a single leather bag. It contained only a few simple clothes, the old fairy tale book Zevian had once read aloud to her during sleepless nights, the tiny wooden wolf carved by the orphan children, and a folded blanket she had quietly begun sewing for the baby before learning she would be leaving the kingdom. She gently placed both hands over her stomach once more. "My little one," she whispered softly. A warm smile appeared, despite the sadness in her eyes. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring." She closed her eyes. "But I promise you this." Her voice trembled with emotion. "You will always know that you were wanted." She inhaled slowly. "You will always know that you were loved." Fresh tears gathered again. "And even if your father never learns about you," she smiled through them, "I'll tell you every day how brave he once was." She picked up the leather bag, then quietly walked toward the door. Outside, the palace courtyard had already filled with soldiers dressed in crimson armor. King Magnus's royal carriage waited near the entrance, its black horses standing perfectly still as morning mist drifted across the cobblestone ground. Several palace servants stood nearby, with red eyes, unable to hide their grief. News of Nyra's departure had spread quietly throughout the palace during the night, though no one dared question the Alpha King's decision. The elderly royal healer stood near the palace steps, clutching a small pouch filled with medicinal herbs. When Nyra approached, the old woman embraced her tightly. "I wish things had been different." Nyra smiled sadly. So do I. The healer slipped the small pouch into Nyra's hands. You'll need these during the journey. Nyra understood immediately. They weren't for ordinary illness. They were herbs that ease morning sickness. She squeezed the healer's hands gratefully. Thank you. The old woman looked into her eyes. Are you absolutely certain you won't tell him? Nyra lowered her gaze. If I tell him now, she looked toward the palace, he'll only suffer more. The healer wanted to argue. Instead, she simply nodded. High above the courtyard, hidden behind the balcony pillars, Alpha King Zevian watched everything unfold. He had stood there since before sunrise. He had watched servants quietly load Nyra's belongings into the carriage, watched palace maids wipe tears from their faces. He had watched his mate preparing to leave forever. His wolf raged inside him. Stop this! The voice echoed violently through his mind. She belongs beside us. Zevian gripped the stone railing so tightly that cracks slowly formed beneath his fingers. I know. Then run to her. His breathing became uneven. Tell her not to go. He closed his eyes. If I stop her, images filled his mind. Starving children, burned villages, empty granaries, his people. The crown felt unbearably heavy. For the first time in his life, he hated being king. Nyra slowly reached the carriage. Just before stepping inside, she stopped. Something deep inside her heart urged her to look back. She turned slowly toward the palace. Far above, on the highest balcony, she saw him, Zevian. Even from that distance, she could recognize the pain written across his face. Their eyes met. Time itself seemed to stop. No words were spoken. No gestures were made. Everything they wished to say remained trapped inside the silence between them. Nyra waited, just for one impossible moment. A tiny part of her still believed he would come running. She imagined him racing down the palace stairs, pushing past the guards, taking her hand, and telling everyone the bargain was over. She imagined hearing him say the words she longed to hear. Stay. But the palace doors never opened. The courtyard remained still. Zevian never moved. A single tear escaped Nyra's eye. She smiled sadly, not because she was happy, but because hope had finally let go. Very slowly, she climbed into the carriage. The door closed. The sharp sound echoed across the silent courtyard like the ending of a beautiful dream. King Magnus climbed into the carriage opposite her. He noticed the tears quietly running down her face. For several moments, he said nothing. Finally, I'm sorry. Nyra looked toward the window. The carriage began moving. Its wheels rolled slowly across the palace courtyard, past the gardens where she and Zevian had planted moon lilies together, past the orphanage where children had called her family, past the gates she had entered as a joyful bride 3 years earlier. She never looked back again. On the balcony above, Zevian remained frozen. He watched until the carriage disappeared beyond the palace gates. Only then did his legs finally give way. He dropped to his knees. His breathing became ragged. His entire body trembled. Ronan quietly approached from behind. My king. Zevian never looked up. I just watched my entire world leave. For the first time since wearing the crown, the Alpha King no longer felt like the ruler of Blackstone. He felt like the loneliest man alive. The royal carriage rolled steadily along the snow-covered road, leading away from Blackstone Kingdom. Every turn of the wheels carried Luna Nyra farther from the life she had once believed would last forever. She sat quietly beside the carriage window, watching the familiar mountains slowly disappear behind the morning mist. The towering castle, where she had spent 3 beautiful years with Zevian, eventually became nothing more than a tiny shadow against the horizon, before vanishing completely. Only then did she finally lower her eyes. She had promised herself she would not look back again. Looking back would only make leaving harder, and she had already cried enough tears to fill an ocean. Inside the carriage, silence settled comfortably between her and King Magnus. Unlike many rulers Nyra had met during royal gatherings, Magnus did not fill every quiet moment with unnecessary conversation. He seemed to understand that grief sometimes needed silence more than words. Several times he glanced toward her, noticing how tightly she held the small wooden wolf in her hands. But he never asked about it. Instead, he simply poured a warm cup of herbal tea and quietly placed it beside her. "You should drink," he said gently. Nyra looked at the steaming cup before offering him a polite smile. "Thank you." She wrapped both hands around it, welcoming the warmth against her cold fingers. The pleasant scent of mint and mountain herbs immediately eased the nausea that had troubled her throughout the morning. Magnus noticed the slight change in her expression. "Better?" he asked. She nodded softly. "Much." "I'm glad," he said. That was all he said. He asked no questions. He demanded no conversation. For that small kindness alone, Nyra silently thanked him. Their journey lasted several days. Each evening, the royal caravan stopped in peaceful villages or hunting lodges scattered across the northern forests. Unlike what Nyra had feared, Magnus never forced her to remain beside him. Separate rooms were prepared every night, and the servants treated her not as a prisoner, but as an honored guest. Whenever they stopped to rest, Magnus personally ensured she had warm meals before sitting down to eat himself. The strange kindness confused her. She had expected resentment or coldness from the man who had taken her away from Blackstone. Instead, she found quiet respect. On the 4th morning, the caravan paused beside a beautiful frozen lake surrounded by towering pine trees. The rising sun painted the snow in brilliant shades of gold, turning the entire landscape into something that looked almost magical. Nyra stepped outside the carriage to breathe the crisp mountain air. She wrapped her cloak tightly around herself before walking slowly toward the edge of the lake. For the first time in many days, she smiled. The silence reminded her of peaceful mornings she and Zevian had once shared before the kingdom fell into hardship. She knelt carefully beside the frozen water. "My little wolf," she whispered, resting one hand gently against her stomach. "I wish your father could see this." A tiny breeze moved through the trees. She closed her eyes. "I hope one day," her voice became softer, "you'll know that he loved you." She remained there for several minutes, before another wave of nausea suddenly forced her to sit on a nearby rock. She breathed slowly, until it passed. She didn't realize someone had been watching. King Magnus approached quietly. "Are you all right?" Nyra looked up quickly. "I'm fine." He studied her face. "You've been saying that every morning." She smiled weakly. "I'll be all right." Magnus hesitated. "My royal physician is traveling with us." She shook her head gently. "There's no need." "You seem unwell." Nyra looked toward the frozen lake. "I already know what's causing it." Magnus frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Silence followed. For a long moment, Nyra wondered whether she should tell him. Eventually, she nodded almost to herself. "You deserve to know." Magnus waited patiently. Nyra slowly placed both hands over her stomach. His eyes followed the movement. Understanding dawned upon his face. His voice became almost a whisper. "You're carrying a child." Nyra nodded. "Yes." Magnus remained perfectly still. He looked toward the mountains before smiling gently. "Congratulations." Nyra blinked. She had expected surprise, perhaps even frustration. Instead, she sought genuine happiness. "You aren't angry?" Magnus looked back at her. "Why would I be? The child belongs to Zevian." He smiled kindly. "Of course he does." Nyra stared at him. Magnus folded his hands behind his back. I never asked for another man's child. He looked at her with complete sincerity. I simply agreed to protect a woman whose kingdom needed saving. Nyra's eyes slowly filled with tears. No one had spoken to her with such kindness since leaving Blackstone. Magnus continued quietly. From this moment forward, he bowed his head respectfully. Both you and your child are under my protection. Nyra lowered her eyes. Magnus smiled. Every child deserves to be welcomed with love. Several days later, the enormous gates of Crimson Moon Kingdom finally appeared beyond the snowy hills. Massive stone walls surrounded one of the most prosperous cities Nyra had ever seen. Unlike Blackstone, where signs of war remained visible throughout the villages, Crimson Moon overflowed with life. Marketplaces bustled with merchants, children laughed while chasing one another through the streets, and musicians played cheerful melodies near the city square. As the royal carriage entered the capital, citizens gathered along the roads, bowing respectfully to their king. Many looked curiously toward Nyra, wondering who the beautiful woman traveling beside King Magnus might be. Magnus noticed her uneasiness. Don't worry. She looked toward him. No one here will disrespect you. The carriage stopped before an enormous palace overlooking a crystal blue lake. Marble staircases led toward magnificent carved doors, while beautiful winter roses bloomed despite the snow. Nyra stepped down slowly. A group of servants immediately bowed. Welcome, Lady Nyra. She looked surprised. One elderly housekeeper smiled warmly. His Majesty prepared the Eastern Palace wing especially for you. Nyra followed them quietly through the grand halls. When the doors finally opened, she stopped in amazement. The rooms were elegant without feeling overwhelming. Large windows overlooked the frozen lake. Shelves already held dozens of books, and a warm fire crackled inside the stone fireplace. Then she noticed something that made her heart stop. On the windowsill sat a vase filled with fresh moon lilies. She slowly walked toward them. They're beautiful, she whispered. The elderly housekeeper smiled. His Majesty heard they were your favorite flowers. Nyra gently touched one delicate white petal. Tears quietly filled her eyes again, not because she loved Magnus. She didn't. But because after losing everything, someone had still remembered something that made her smile. Far away in Blackstone Kingdom, however, Alpha King Zevian stood alone inside the empty bedroom he once shared with Nyra. Everything remained exactly as she had left it. Her favorite book rested on the bedside table. A half-finished embroidery lay near the fireplace. Her lavender perfume still lingered faintly in the air. The silence inside the room felt unbearable. As he slowly sat on the edge of the bed, something caught his attention. A folded piece of parchment rested beneath Nyra's pillow. His heart began beating faster. With trembling hands, he reached for it. The first line read, "My dearest Zevian." His entire world stopped. Alpha King Zevian stood motionless in the center of their empty bedroom, the folded letter trembling in his hands. The room still carried Nyra's gentle presence. Her lavender perfume lingered faintly in the air, and the soft blue curtains she had chosen swayed gently as the evening breeze drifted through the open window. Nothing had changed since she left that morning. Her favorite chair remained beside the fireplace. The half-finished blanket she had been sewing rested quietly in the basket beside the bed. Every corner of the room reminded him of the life they had built together. His hands shook as he slowly unfolded the letter. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Every word had been written by Nyra herself. A single tear landed on the parchment before he even began reading. My dearest Zevian, if you're reading this, it means I have already left Blackstone. I didn't write this letter because I wanted to make you feel guilty. I wrote it because I couldn't leave without telling you what was in my heart." Zevian swallowed painfully. His vision had already become blurred. "When I first met you, you weren't a king. You were simply a stubborn young alpha who couldn't stop talking about how you would change the world. You laughed often. You smiled without pretending. You believed every problem could be solved if people loved one another enough." A faint smile appeared through his tears. He remembered that young man. He barely recognized him now. "I never fell in love with your crown. I fell in love with your heart." His breathing became uneven. "The kingdom needed you. I understood that long before anyone else did. I knew becoming king would change your life. I accepted that because I believed no matter how heavy the crown became, we would always carry it together." He closed his eyes. His heart felt as though it were breaking all over again. "When King Magnus came, I know you believed you were protecting everyone. I know you never stopped loving me. I saw that in your eyes last night. But love without trust becomes loneliness." Zevian lowered his head. Every sentence struck deeper than the one before. "You didn't lose me because you loved your kingdom. You lost me because you believed you had to carry every burden alone." His knees suddenly became weak. He slowly sat on the edge of the bed. "If someday you learn anything from this pain, I hope it is this. A king is strongest when he allows the people who love him to stand beside him." Tears streamed freely down his face. "Please don't hate yourself forever. Take care of Blackstone. Protect the children. Feed the hungry. Smile again." The final line had been written more carefully than all the others, almost as though she had paused for a very long time before writing it. "No matter where life takes me, you'll always be my first love. Goodbye, your Nyra." The letter slipped from Zevian's fingers onto the floor. He buried his face in both hands. For several long minutes, the Alpha King cried without trying to hide it. The palace servants outside heard nothing but silence. Them dared enter. Late that evening, Beta Ronin quietly knocked on the bedroom door. "My king?" No answer. "My king?" "Finally, come in." Ronin slowly entered. The moment he saw Zevian's face, he froze. His king looked as though he had aged 10 years in a single day. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. His shoulders were slumped. The once proud Alpha looked completely broken. Ronin noticed the letter lying on the floor. "Did she?" Zevian nodded silently. "She forgave me." Ronin smiled sadly. "Then there is still hope." Zevian shook his head. "No." He looked toward the empty side of the bed. "I don't deserve hope." Several days passed. Blackstone's debts disappeared exactly as Magnus had promised. Food wagons began arriving from neighboring kingdoms. Soldiers received their overdue wages. The villages slowly began rebuilding. By every measure, the kingdom had been saved. Yet inside the palace, nothing felt victorious. Every evening Zevian wandered through empty gardens where he and Nyra once walked together. He could no longer bring himself to eat in the royal dining hall because every chair reminded him of her. He stopped attending celebrations. He stopped hunting. He even stopped playing the old wooden flute Nyra had always loved hearing during quiet evenings. The kingdom had regained its future. Its king had lost his. One rainy afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after Nyra's departure, the elderly royal healer hurried toward the throne room with unusual urgency. "My king!" Zevian immediately stood. "What happened?" The old woman hesitated. Her hands trembled. "There is something I should have told you before the Luna left." The entire throne room became silent. Zevian's heartbeat quickened. "What is it?" The healer struggled to speak. "My king." Tears gathered in her eyes. "The night before Lady Nyra departed, she came to see me." Zevian frowned. "Was she ill?" The healer slowly nodded. His breathing became uneven. "And?" The elderly woman finally whispered the words. "She wasn't sick." A long silence followed. "Then, she was carrying your child." Everything around Zevian stopped. The throne room disappeared. The voices disappeared. Even his own heartbeat seemed to vanish. He stared at the healer in complete disbelief. "What?" Fresh tears rolled down the old woman's face. "Our Luna is with child. She left Blackstone." Her voice broke. "Carrying your heir." The words echoed endlessly inside Zevian's mind. His child. Nyra had been carrying their baby. The child they had prayed for. The child they had dreamed about, and she had left believing she would raise that child alone. Zevian staggered backward until he collided with one of the stone pillars. His breathing became ragged. "My baby," he whispered. "Our baby." Every memory suddenly returned. Nyra had looked unusually tired. The moments she had quietly held her stomach. The times she had barely touched her meals. He had been too consumed by saving his kingdom to notice that his greatest blessing had already begun growing inside the woman he loved. Tears streamed down his face as realization crushed him. Without another word, Alpha King Zevian turned toward the palace doors. "Prepare my horse." Ronan looked at him. "My king?" Zevian's silver eyes burned with determination. "I don't care how far I have to ride." He grabbed his sword and cloak. "I'm bringing my wife." His voice cracked with emotion. "And my child." He looked toward the northern mountains. Home. The entire palace erupted into motion. Within minutes, royal guards saddled Zevian's fastest black stallion, while Beta Ronan gathered 20 of Blackstone's finest warriors. "My king," Ronan said, "we can leave immediately." Zevian shook his head. "No." Ronan frowned. "The fewer soldiers I bring, the less it will look like a threat." Looked toward the northern road. "I'm not riding to start another war." His voice became quiet. "I'm riding to beg my wife for forgiveness." Only Ronan accompanied him. As the palace gates opened, thousands of citizens watched their Alpha King gallop toward the northern mountains. Many whispered prayers. Some cried, because everyone now knew the truth. Their king had saved the kingdom, but lost his family. For 6 days they rode without stopping, through blizzards, across frozen rivers, over dangerous mountain passes. Several times Ronan begged Zevian to rest. Each time, the Alpha King shook his head. "My child is waiting." On the 7th evening, the towers of Crimson Moon Kingdom finally appeared beneath the setting sun. King Magnus was already waiting. He stood calmly at the palace entrance as Zevian climbed off his exhausted horse. The two Alpha Kings faced one another once again. Neither reached for a weapon. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Magnus broke the silence. "You came." Zevian bowed his head. "I came for my wife. And my child." Magnus studied him carefully. "You know." Zevian nodded. "I only learned a week ago." Magnus sighed. "I wondered how long it would take." "You knew?" "I learned during the journey." Zevian's expression fell. "And you didn't tell me." Magnus looked directly into his eyes. "It wasn't my secret to tell." The answer left Zevian speechless. Magnus stepped aside. "Follow me." They walked through the palace gardens, until they reached the beautiful eastern wing, overlooking the lake. Magnus stopped outside a white wooden door. "She's inside." Zevian's heart pounded. Magnus quietly placed one hand on his shoulder. "If you truly love her," he smiled gently, "don't speak as a king. Speak as the man she married." Then Magnus walked away. Zevian stood outside the door for what felt like an eternity. His hand hovered above the wood. He couldn't knock. For the first time in his life, the fearless Alpha King was afraid. Finally, he knocked. A soft voice answered, "Come in." The moment Zevian opened the door, Nyra looked up from the chair beside the fireplace. The book slipped from her hands. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Only silence. Then, Nyra whispered, "Zevian." He couldn't stop the tears. "I'm sorry." 3 simple words. Nothing more. He slowly walked toward her, before falling onto both knees, not as a king, not as an alpha, simply as a husband who had broken his own heart. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve another chance." Nyra remained silent. "I came because I finally understood." He looked up at her. "I thought being king meant carrying every burden alone. I thought protecting my people meant sacrificing the person I loved. I was wrong." He wiped away his tears. "I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting myself from asking for your strength." Nyra's eyes slowly filled with tears. Zevian lowered his head again. "I read your letter. You were right. You never stopped standing beside me. I was the one who walked away." He placed both hands over his heart. "I know about our baby." Nyra froze. The room became completely silent. "You," her voice shook. "No, the healer finally told me." Fresh tears streamed down his face. "I missed the happiest news of my life. I'm so sorry. I should have been beside you. Should have protected both of you. I should have trusted you." His shoulders shook. "If you never forgive me, I'll understand. But please," he looked into her eyes, "don't let our child grow up believing his father abandoned him. I'll spend the rest of my life proving I can become the man you deserved from the beginning." Silence. Long, painful silence. Nyra slowly walked toward him. He didn't move. He didn't even dare breathe. She gently lifted his face with both hands. "I never stopped loving you." Zevian closed his eyes. "But love doesn't erase pain." "I know." She smiled sadly. "You broke my heart. I know. You made me believe I wasn't your partner. I know." Another tear rolled down her cheek. "If we do this again," she looked deeply into his eyes, "we start over. No secrets. I promise. No decisions without each other. I swear. You trust me, with my life." She smiled through tears. "Then stand up." He slowly stood. The next second, Nyra wrapped both arms around him. Zevian held her as though he would never let go again. For a long time, neither of them spoke. 1 year later. The kingdom of Blackstone had changed in ways no one could have imagined. The empty food stores were now overflowing. The villages that had once struggled to survive had been rebuilt. Children laughed freely in the streets, and every home had enough to eat. But the greatest change was inside the royal palace. King Zevian never again ruled alone. Every important decision was first discussed with Queen Nyra. Whenever the royal council gathered, a second throne stood beside his. One morning, as the council debated a difficult matter, Zevian smiled and said, "My queen, what do you think?" The nobles exchanged amused glances. It had become his favorite question. Nyra smiled warmly before offering her advice. As always, it was wise. The council unanimously agreed. After the meeting, Ronan chuckled. "My king, there was a time when you refused help from anyone." Zevian laughed. "And that was the greatest mistake of my life." A few months later, the palace bells rang throughout the kingdom. Queen Nyra had gone into labor. Zevian waited outside the royal chamber, pacing nervously. Ronan folded his arms with a grin. "You've fought rogue alphas. You've faced war. I've never seen you this frightened." "I'd rather fight 100 wars," Zevian replied, "than wait outside this door." Moments later, the royal healer stepped outside with tears of joy. "Congratulations, your majesties. You have a healthy baby boy." Zevian rushed inside. Nyra smiled tiredly as she cradled their son. The tiny baby opened bright silver eyes that looked exactly like his father. Zevian gently lifted him into his arms. His voice broke. "Hello, my little prince." The baby wrapped his tiny hand around Zevian's finger. The Alpha King burst into tears. Nyra laughed softly. "I think he's already wrapped you around his little finger." A week later, King Magnus arrived at Blackstone Palace, carrying a beautifully carved wooden cradle as a gift. Zevian embraced him like a brother. "I can never repay what you did for us," Magnus smiled. "You already have. You chose love." He looked at the sleeping baby. "Take good care of your family." "I will." The two kingdoms signed a treaty of everlasting peace that very day. From then on, Blackstone and Crimson Moon stood together as allies. Every spring, Queen Nyra planted white moon lilies in the palace gardens. One afternoon, their little son ran laughing through the flowers, while Zevian chased after him. Nyra watched them from the balcony, smiling. Zevian looked back at her. "If I had one wish," he said quietly, "it would be to live this moment forever." Nyra walked over and slipped her hand into his. "You don't need a wish. You already have it." They stood together, watching the sun disappear beyond the mountains. The same mountains that had once separated them, now witnessed the family they had fought so hard to protect. And from that day forward, Alpha King Zevian ruled not only with strength, but with love, trust, and humility. For he had learned that the greatest king is not the one who sacrifices his family for his kingdom, but the one who sacrifices his kingdom for his family, one who protects them both. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed today's story, please support the channel by liking this video, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing to Zevian and Nyra's story. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you'll be notified whenever we upload a new Alpha romance story. Your support means a great deal to us, and we look forward to seeing you in our next story. Until then, take care, and thank you for being part of our community.